Hello. My attention was caught by a comment underneath my Grammy video. The writer said that as a straight man, he has no interest in fashion, but he finds my rundown of what works and what doesn't work in the way someone gets dressed to be a glimpse into another way of looking at the world, which did interest him. I appreciated that, and I thought I might just say a few more words. I'm not going to go into all sorts of fashion, don't worry. I'm just talking about the usefulness of it in judging the aspirations and the structures of the world in which that fashion has developed. Bear with me. First of all, I'm going to show you one of the first fashion icons, Queen Elizabeth I. And this is her daddy, Henry VIII. I want you to look at that codpiece there. It was there so that it could be undone easily whenever a man wanted to, well, as Shakespeare put it, to look upon the hedge. Now, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, all men wore breeches with codpieces, just like they had done during the reign of Henry VIII. 20 years in to Elizabeth I's reign, the codpiece had completely disappeared. Even more than that, breeches had become, men's breeches had become really overblown and flouncy. They even had bum rolls to hold them out. Yeah, they were even padded out. So to start with, they looked like the top part of a skirt, a woman's skirt of the time. Now, why? Well, the Queen wore skirts. She was in control. The men were imitating the shape of the Queen's clothes. And in previous, I'll find a picture. There's a picture called The Ambassadors. I'll find just one picture. It was painted by Holbein during the reign of Henry VIII. And it's something very striking. There's a man and he's standing there, and you can see his clothes do not look like female clothes of the time. I noticed that particularly, and also Henry VIII, but I remember this ambassador, so I'll put him up. But they don't look anything like women's clothes of the time. Whereas now the men's clothes were starting to imitate the shape of women's clothes, at least in part. And that's because the Queen was the boss. I'm just pointing this out as an example of how the fashion of one sex will have an effect on the fashion of the other. Okay, so let's jump now to the beginning of the 19th century. In the late 1820s, when there was a serious lack of men because the Napoleonic Wars had pruned a generation of younger men up to 1815, which meant that by 1825, when they would have been getting married, they weren't there. Women were starting to dress like little girls. Do you think that, I mean, ridiculously like little girls and like dolls? Do you think this was an accident? Of course it wasn't. They were doing their best to look as young and as sort of frilly as they could to attract what men there were left. Now, if you jump a century ahead in the 1940s, when the world was at war, women started to adopt a sort of can-do military cut with those padded shoulders to show they could shoulder responsibilities. And although, yes, there was fabric rationing at the time, so clothes had to be simple, but those padded shoulders, they just added to the amount of material you had in your dress. So that was definitely not an economy measure. No, it was a squaring up, because these women had to square up to doing stuff because there were no men in the country who could do it. They were all out with guns across the channel. But after the war, when what men were left came back, there was a little bit of an imbalance. There were more women than men. There was a dearth of available marriage partners as far as the women were concerned. And suddenly women started to emphasize their feminine characteristics again. The small waists, the busts and the sloping shoulders, all those shoulder pads, they went. Do you think that was an accident? Of course it wasn't. Now, let's go back to Elizabeth I. She's covered in jewels. What does that say? Well, it says that even in a relatively lawless place like England in the 16th century, this woman is so powerful, so rich, and so well guarded that she can walk around with a king's ransom, literally a king's ransom, in precious stones round her neck, sewn all over her dress and festooning her hair, and nobody's going to touch her. Now let's go to the Grammys, and you have people wearing costumes that say the same thing. They don't wear a lot of jewellery because they know anyone can get sparklies for next to nothing nowadays. So no, they literally wear next to nothing because that says, I am so rich, so important that I have security people to make sure that my state of near nakedness isn't going to get me into any trouble. Of course, the problems arise when impressionable children try to do the same thing, and then they do get into trouble. They don't have the security men in the dark glasses. Oh, and by the way, that goes for those ridiculous long nails as well that seem to be the fashion. They just say, look, I can't do anything with these things on the end of my fingers, but it doesn't matter because I can get people to do everything for me, including buttons and that sort of thing. And I'm not just talking about the women, you chaps. Just remember that you are as susceptible to fashion and those sorts of streams of social development as the women. Those men who came back from the war in the 1940s, they saw military uniforms and nothing but for years. When they came back home, they wanted their dreams of the little woman waiting at home. They didn't want strong women in military jackets. They wanted small-waisted, fertile, curly girls with bosoms that reminded them of all their fantasies of back home and nobody shooting at them. So yes, fashion is important because clothes have been important to human beings as long as we have been recognisably human. In fact, you could argue that civilization started when some cave woman found a sharp bit of bone and thought, if I put a thin strip of leather or a piece of horsehair from a tail through the end of that, I could make those two small skins into one much bigger skin. And then it would look like my man is a better hunter than all the rest of them. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.